and we have a set of questions we'd like to ask him. Alan Stein here is going to begin with the questioning.
To begin with, Professor Smelser, we wanted to get some background on your own personal development, both as a person and as an academic. And the first question has to do with how you came to be interested in sociology as a discipline.
Well, it goes back really to my own family life. I grew up in an academic family. My father was a teacher of philosophy in a community college. My mother was a teacher of Latin and English in high school level, and all three of the sons ended up in some kind of academic work. So it was a strong family culture, and there we are. I guess my father had the biggest influence on me. He was a person himself of agrarian background, but educated at university, and very, very much interested in the society, particularly the political dimension of society. This was during the New Deal, and of course the society was very politicized during much of that. And the whole question of issue in morals and politics and the nature of the society, welfare questions and so on, all the time talked about in the family. So and I just kind of knew that this was going to be my culture. With respect to specific interest in sociology, that was a while in developing. When I went to university in 1948 at Harvard, I was very much struggling with the degree to which I wanted to follow in my father's own field. And I did take a good deal of philosophy and was somewhat moved to major in philosophy and make it a life career. But during my freshman year, I sort of discovered the Department of Social Relations there. I took courses with Gordon Allforth, the psychologist, and George Homans, the sociologist. Homans didn't inspire me too much, but he had a lot of people who came to the class who did. And I also took a course with Clyde Cluckhone in my first year. So I decided to major in social relations. That was sociology, anthropology, social psychology, clinical psychology. I did most of my work in clinical psychology, being very much inspired by a man named Henry Murray, and was tempted also to go into psychology as well. And I didn't really decide. I knew I wanted to go on in the social sciences some way, but I really never decided that I would choose sociology until after I had graduated and was studying at Oxford University. I knew I was going to go in one of those social sciences, and when I was at Oxford, I studied politics, philosophy, and economics. But meantime, coming to the conclusion, I wanted to continue in sociology.
And it was at Harvard that you met Tuckett Parsons?
As a junior, I took a course from him in the first part of my junior year. Big course, 300 people, didn't get to know him, but a very inspiring course in American institutional structure. I got to know him during the course of my senior year a little bit, and then we met when I was studying in England.
Maybe you could follow up a little bit on that relationship, focusing in particular on his particular way of accomplishing the sociological enterprise, focusing on method, focusing on the tradition in sociology that comes out of his method, and perhaps the values which you feel inform that method, and perhaps were also part of your personal relationship.
Well, I can talk about those things at some length. I don't regard myself as working since that time precisely in the mold that I studied under Parsons with and collaborated with. I think Parsons probably brought the functionalist approach to sociology to a kind of point of sophistication that it hadn't got to before. You see, the functionalist model had really came out of biology in my estimation, and via Radcliffe Brown and Durkheim to some degree, and really had a thoroughgoing organismic analogy behind it, which it never fully left. And it also even used the language of survival if certain structures did not meet certain functions, right? That was a lot in the early functionalist literature. Parsons and I sort of got away from that, and we sort of talked more about functions that, functional exigencies which set problems for society. And not that it was going to die if it didn't meet them. We didn't follow along that analogy, but to which resources and structures were oriented, and on the basis of which you could classify and understand the interrelations among structures in society. The advance I think Parsons made was to take this list of exigencies, which is usually found in the earlier textbooks as having to do with socialization, economic survival, maintenance of some kind of social order and coordination and so on, and systematize these in much more logical relationship to one another in terms of the four system problems, and to generalize them from society to other systems as well. I think that kind of accomplishment was an exceptional one. It didn't carry as far as it might have in terms of the generating of empirical social science knowledge, but from the standpoint of theory, I regarded that advance in functionalism to have been very, very significant indeed. As a matter of fact, that crystallization in the 1950s pretty much stuck with Parsons during the rest of his career and dominated his thinking about whatever he happened to write about. Now, in terms of my relations with Parsons, you had to understand that it was a relationship that developed, you might say, in a premature way as far as my own career is concerned. I was only a junior in college when I came across him, and he was approximately the age of my own father. And he was regarded as probably the leading sociologist in the United States at that time. So that there was enormous status and age difference between us. And I was also quite premature when we decided to collaborate together. I just had my 24th birthday at this time and not done any graduate work at all. So here it was, a relationship that was very tilted and in many ways a kind of intimidating relationship, you might imagine. Parsons was an intimidating man, not in the usual sense of the term, but he was intimidating first because he was a very shy man and made you feel uneasy in his presence, and secondly, the sheer power of his mind had this sort of intimidating effect when you were in his presence. Always thinking, I've never seen a person who was as thoroughly devoted and committed to the intellectual life as Parsons was. He was just always, there's a very, very, very little differentiation between his self and his intellect, I thought. I'm not the only one who made that observation. However, he had a certain receptivity that tended to diminish this feeling of intimidation, and after we began working more closely with one another, he truly did treat one like an equal, and was open to one's ideas, and was open to criticism, was open to even ideas that he ultimately didn't agree with. He was always careful to give people credit for their ideas and so on, a sort of gentleman in that sense of the term. So consequently, even though there was this overtone of shyness and which you always had to overcome when you first saw him again after an absence or something like that, it was a very congenial working relationship, and I attribute a lot of that to him.
Now, your work that you suggested that we read in preparation for this interview, Social Change in the Industrial Revolution, was work that you accomplished in this relationship with Dr. Parsons. And perhaps you could focus a bit on that work in terms of how you feel it took the Parsonian method from the theoretical position you described it as having, and use that theoretical method in an empirical piece of research, and what was advanced by that particular study at that time, given the history that the Parsonian tradition had up until that moment.
Well, Parsons had been working in a line that had come out of the Bales small group studies. Was very much interested in the emergence of roles and specialized activities in small groups. And he had taken that up and had exploited it extensively in his immediately previous work on the family, applying the theory of structural differentiation, not only to the family, but to the development of personality within the family, right? So that model of change was one which was very much in the air when I was working with him. And as a matter of fact, chapter 5 of Economy and Society developed a model of structural differentiation for the first time at the macro level, and we reanalyzed the Burlean means theory of separation of ownership and management in the firm as a special instance of structural differentiation. But we sort of left it there. It was this kind of illustrative example of, but the model I used in social change in the Industrial Revolution was pretty much in place. What I did was to highlight certain features of it. I did not really exploit the classificatory functional aspects of it, but picked up more the model of change, and that was, I'm most especially interested in that. And furthermore, and I altered it to some degree in various ways. I won't go into detail now. The main difference, however, and this had to do with almost constantly heard criticism of Parsons' work at the time, because it wasn't able to account for any process of change. And I was very much interested in applying it to a historical case, and I was very much interested in mobilizing as much of the best empirical data I could find to do it, because that was another line of criticism of this particular body of thought, namely that it wasn't empirically based. And I guess I did that with vengeance. If you read the footnotes. I chose England for two reasons. I believe that the British Industrial Revolution was a particularly interesting case because it was the first one. And secondly, I really had quite a lot of intellectual capital invested in knowledge of British society and British economic and social history. I studied that a good deal at Oxford, so I thought it was a very good way to capitalize on this additional experience.
If I may, I want to read a quotation from the introduction of your book, and perhaps we can use this as a follow-on question. Each time one looks to the past, he is guided by certain assumptions or presumptions about what should be lifted from the chronicle of recorded history. Such assumptions are necessary to select from history's endless facts. They are ideas, concepts, abstractions, or notions which permit the observer to reconstruct meaningful relationships among the facts which interest him. No matter how avid the historian's concern for facts, he must use such assumptions. These assumptions, if we could ask you for the next question to illuminate what the assumptions are that, or were, and may still be, that went into social change in the Industrial Revolution, that are, you would say, are incorporated into the tradition that Parsons developed, and perhaps even going back further in terms of the philosophy of science, those assumptions that come from the school of positivism, which informed the Parsonian tradition. Maybe you could illuminate some of those issues for us, focusing on methodology.
Well, the first thing that prior assumptions do is to guide you to certain types of facts and instruct you in their selection. So, in the broadest sense of the term, I was interested in social structure. I was interested in the degree to which social structure is specialized. Now, this already begins to select from a lot of different possibilities. So that's the most simple-minded answer I can give to your question, namely that you have a few categories in your mind. If I was interested especially in class domination or exploitation, I'd begin looking in other ways. As it turned out, that focus did force itself on me at certain points in the analysis, but this whole problem of selectivity. Another kind of assumption that was built into that particular model was an assumption of the what I might call open-ended evolutionary assumption. That is to say, not that I had a typology of types of society from which a given country or nation would develop into another type. In other words, it's not Spenserian in that sense of the word, or Marxian either, but it had to do with the idea, it had to do more with the mechanisms by which a society becomes more complex. And I did not envision other possibilities, such as its breaking down, such as it's undergoing some kind of retrogression or decline or something of the sort. It was a growth model, right? And those assumptions were built into it. I had certain assumptions about under the heading of social control, about the degree of effectiveness that agencies of social control display under conditions of political disturbance. And I assumed that these political disturbances would be brought into line, as I called it then, and the energy would be, of the political protest would be channeled toward more productive lines of social change, and thereby the reduction of conflict. There was a conflict management element in there too. All of these things are things that can and have been relaxed and changed for other purposes, but that's an example of the kinds of, you might say, blinders. Now, interestingly, E.P. Thompson took me to task on that particular methodological point of view. In his book on the making of the working class, he said, let history speak to you. Let the people of history speak to you. They make their own history, and we let the historical facts speak. Well, that's in direct contradiction, really, to the methodological position I made there. In some sense, he's more of a positivist than I was. From that point of view, you see, this is not a very positivistic point of view, because it says facts are really relative. There isn't some fixed reality out there that we go look at and speaks to us. We have to select from it. Necessarily, we can't think about the social world without simplifying it in some way, and that means distorting its quotes facts.
So in that sense, are you saying that a significant, one of the things that came out of this study was a more hermeneutical aspect of your own methodology as it developed from this time on? More of an interpretive framework rather than looking for existing facts?
Well, I surely in that work was much interested in grasping the meaning of the historical situation as it presumably existed in the minds of the main actors there. That's hermeneutical. The one big difference was that in some respects I didn't take them at their face value. That is to say, as descriptive of the historical period. I took them as phenomena to be explained. Because why is it that people should have gotten so worried about child labor at this particular point in history? Or why is it that once they started worrying about child labor, they began worry about women's labor? Or why is it that they began envisioning various kinds of utopian social arrangements? And what was the relationship between these kinds of mentality and the structures in which they were living? Now, that's hermeneutical in the sense it takes people's meanings into account, but it also takes them to something to be explained by factors that may not have been available to them and with which they might not have agreed. Right? So it's I call it an intermediate methodological position with respect to the issue that you've raised.
If we could go a little bit further on this issue of the ways in which theories sort of generate almost their facts. You, shortly after talking about the role that assumptions play in choosing facts, then talk about the ways in which theories can be evaluated. And in particular, you address two theories. One is the laissez-faire sort of interpretation of the same period, and the other is the Marxist theory of the same period.
Yes.
And, well, first of all, why don't you describe how it is that theories of those sort with regards to this period can be compared?
Well, the theories can be compared along a number of lines. They can be compared along the lines we've just been discussing, namely what are their prior assumptions. They can be compared in terms of their dominant causal factors that they appeal to, and they can be compared in terms of what it is that they try to explain. Now, some theories are not comparable to one another with respect to this last view because they choose such entirely different problems. So that the basis on which I felt impelled to compare my own theory with that of Marx and with that of the British socialist historians and that of laissez-faire people was that all three of us were really interested in why it was that workers protested against the capitalist system in the ways they did at that time. That was the point of comparison, and the type of comparison I was interested in making is, given the explanations that are generated out of the theory, what renders the most coherent account of the patterning of the historical data that you find? And that's why I did take on the Marxian interpretation. I mean, this was not to deny that there was class conflict there, but it didn't do too much about explaining the timing and all the content of the disturbances, where I was referring it to other things that were going on in the workers' lives, besides the fact that they were in conflict. That is to say, what drove them into conflict. In a way, I treated conflict as a kind of variable, whereas Marx sort of treated it as a constant. And so I was interested in, well, why in the 1830s did they suddenly go in this direction, and why did they change their direction a few years subsequently, and so on and so forth. It was on the comparison of the adequacy of the several explanatory frameworks that I was comparing the theories.
Well, so then on some level, in your section on the Marxian interpretation of this history, you raise facts, in essence, which the Marxian framework doesn't explain adequately. So in a sense, the facts do become
They're the same facts that Marx addressed, however. In other words, he addressed the whole issue of factory legislation and factory agitation and so on and so forth, but he interpreted those facts in a different framework.
Right.
But the facts were the same, you see. The problem was the same, that is to say, why did this episodes of conflict arise in the time and have this content that it did? And Marx had a reason for that.
Right.
Namely that there were certain types of changes going on in the economic structure that were making exploitation of workers much worse.
Right.
And I had an explanation emanating partly from their work situation, but more generally the way that articulated with their family and community lives. Okay, so I believe it's illegitimate to compare theories that don't address the same problem.
Yes.
And I believe that if possible, you should have the same array of facts before you, so that you can compare them, properly that way.
Right.
A lot of the theoretical controversies in sociology, I believe, tend to be fruitless because they're shooting at different explanatory targets, and they really can't be they really can't be compared with one another.
Yes.
And so you can embrace them, but it's impossible really to say why they're superior to another when none of them are trying to do the same job.
Right. Well, if I could raise it, what might be a Marxist retort to your interpretation of that history, which you address in the book, many Marxists would say that even though exploitation may have been high in a certain particular setting, that certain ideological factors, namely the fact that workers did not understand their own exploitation or did not see their own exploitation, contributed to the fact that they did not resist in the ways that they might have later on. You mentioned in your book that adding this ideological or learning factor weakens the overall explanatory.
Not unless you have a theory of learning. Now, Marx had a sort of rudimentary theory of learning, namely that they missed the whole target by breaking the machines, and then they began to agitate for reform, and subsequently they were going to become truly revolutionary.
Right.
Well, unless you put a timetable on that, and unless you have some mechanism or principle by which this goes on, you aren't going to be explaining anything, because you can appeal to any one of these stages at any different time. I mean, they might still be learning, you see. Since they haven't yet got the true consciousness, they may still be in the phase, but we don't know when they will, or we don't know when they might have historically. So that sort of issue I attacked as being too indeterminate,
Ah,
because you're always right.
Meaning that it both, are you beginning to talk now about the predictive qualities of a theory?
Well,
In terms of social
predictive
change.
in the sense that you use that term in historical study, yes. I don't really see the only difference between historical prediction and prediction in the future is for the future you don't know the answer yet. Whereas in historical you do. But the structure of prediction is the same, namely establishing conditions under which you might expect something to happen and seeing if what did happen in fact comes close to being accounted for by those predictions.
but if I could pursue that a little bit, so in looking into the past, there is an answer ultimately for certain historical events. Even if different frameworks, say different frameworks do approach the same problem, could they come up with mutually exclusive good explanations for why that event
It's an open
happened?
question. I don't think we've got a refined enough grasp on our knowledge to be able to give the true answer to that. I prefer to be a little bit less dogmatic about that matter, and a little more pragmatic.
Uh-huh.
I would say, well, we've set ourselves historical problems, and we have a variety of ways of approaching them, and with luck, we can make some decisions as to which are more fruitful than others, without sort of saying, there is this
Right,
theory for this period or something like that. So it's a little bit more relative, I believe, than
Uh-huh.
your question implied.
right. So in other words, there should be an ongoing conversation between these different frameworks about
Absolutely.
a particular problem.
And hopefully, I wish human nature were different, hopefully, that conversation should be open,
Yes,
rather than dogmatic,
Uh-huh.
but I'm afraid we're not that good.
Right.
And this raises issues of a more generic nature in terms of the major differences between the natural sciences and sociology. And you've begun to speak to those issues. I wonder if it would be fruitful to pursue that a little bit further in terms of how you would differentiate the major philosophical differences and the pragmatic differences between sociology as a discipline and the natural sciences.
Well, substantively, of course, we've got a very different kind of subject matter. I dare say I would not go along with the standard observation that one is more complex than the other, because complexity is often a function of the questions you ask and the theory you build. And say it isn't somehow inherently one more complex than the other. I imagine we probably think the social world is more complex than the natural world because we understand less about it. And at a certain time in history, one could say that people believed the natural world to be more complex because they didn't have the principles by which it operates. I wouldn't go along with that, but I do believe that there's something unique that arises when human beings study one another and utter statements about one another and generate knowledge about one another that the subjects understand. So you don't say that about chemical reactions. You can certainly modify your subject matter on the basis of your knowledge, but it's not in the same kind of reactive way that involves a command of knowledge on can be shared by both researcher and subject, and the knowledge may itself change the behavior of the very phenomenon you're trying to understand. It's, I believe, a different kind of relativity there than you find in the study of natural systems.
Is that a premise that you would include in evaluating the commensurability of social theories?
Well, what it really is the taking into account the causal role of the investigator. The investigator becomes another variable. Well, you have that in the physical sciences as well. If you fake your data, or if you do something that changes the process of that ongoing process that you're studying. But as I say, the dialogue and the interaction with the subject matter in the social sciences is I would say, more complicated. From a methodological point of view, I think there are great continuities. That is to say, if you talk about the systematic study of variation, of determinants of variation, and you make use of various means to control some sources of variation to test out the importance of others, well, I don't see any methodological differences there, because in that sense, social science is a correct copier of the natural sciences, because the constant aim of both is to simplify and control sources of variation so you can isolate and pinpoint causes and the circumstances under which those causes are operative. I mean, we're in the same business there for attempting empirical understanding of the social world. I don't see that one changes those methodological presumptions at all from the methodological ones of the experimental sciences, hard sciences or natural sciences or whatever you want to call them. There are practical differences, of course, in the difficulty in controlling sources of variation in the social world because you can't experiment properly, and the experiments affect the behavior of individuals in different ways than natural science experiments. But nonetheless, when you look at it from the standpoint of the study of variation and the gaining of control over suspected causes in order to refine one's explanations, they're exactly the same. So it's a mix of comparisons and contrasts that I've tried to give you.
Would you say that Durkheim in certain ways presents us an ideal of taking that natural scientific model and applying it to the social world?
Durkheim borrowed, methodologically he borrowed from the natural sciences, and substantively he borrowed from biology in his substantive view of society. No, Durkheim's view in the world is, in the rules of the sociological method, it's to be understood at two levels. One is at the level in which he presented it as a scientific method. It's directly analogous to the physical sciences of the time. When he actually went about his own empirical analyses, I believe he didn't apply it very well, and that's much to his credit, because he had a very, very simplistic notion of social laws, social causes, social effects, and so on. But when he gets to studying the division of labor or suicide or something like that, he uses, in effect, a multivariate and controlled strategy. Gives some great deal of strength to that work. But no, he's the classic model of the positivist scientist in terms of the lectures he gave to us as to how we ought to conduct sociology.
Right. But ultimately, in that book, it seems that you side more with Weber and his methodology rather than that of Durkheim's. Would you say that's an accurate characterization of your own position on methodology?
That's correct, for two reasons. You see, first of all, Durkheim didn't, in his own methodology, he talked about this holy procedure of concomitant variation, correlation, right? And as establishing social laws, and he got himself into all kinds of methodological difficulties in doing that because of the multiple causation of social phenomena. And as I say, when he did his own work, he understood that there were multiple causation, and he tried to take control of it from time in for an example of suicide. Weber understood that, even though he was able to use the comparative method in an effort to keep certain types of variables, such as military organizations, such as legal systems, such as technology, such as populations, and in a more primitive way hold them common in an effort to argue for the importance of spiritual or religious values in social action. But he understood the multivariate quality of life better than Durkheim did from a methodological point of view. And secondly, Durkheim did this crazy thing of ruling psychology out, saying there isn't such thing in sociology, and we've got a science of our own, and we can't look at psychological explanations at all. Whereas Weber had this what I consider to be the much sounder view, that in fact you did have to take the psychology, the meaning systems of actors into account in order to generate any kind of causal explanation of what they were doing. Once you generated an explanation, then, however, you had to go to the rules of science to verify it, or you didn't always take their words for it either. You see, so those are the basic reasons why I think Weber's methodological position is superior to Durkheim's.
I want to kind of focus a little bit more on the notion of progress in social sciences. In the comments you just finished expressing, you seem to be describing a movement that is a progression or an evolution towards a point in time in which sociology will have greater explanatory power as a quote-unquote science than it had in prior years. I'm wondering how we as sociologists evaluate that, can possibly evaluate that progress? What are the components of that evaluation system?
The issue of accumulation?
Yes, accumulation and movement from one paradigm, kind of in the Kuhnian framework, movement from one paradigm to the next, or displacement of one paradigm by another. How do we evaluate progress in the social sciences in that regard?
There are several, again, seems to me I'm getting into the mold of giving you mixed answers, but that's the only kind I find sensible. In the field of research methodology, I think a pretty strong case can be made for accumulation in certain areas. I mean, if you're talking about say the development of systematic sampling and survey and the increased command one gets over sources of error, that sort of thing, you can see lines of increasing sophistication and accuracy, and therefore increased capacity to apply your trade as a social scientist. That's an example. And so in the methodological area, I think a stronger case can be made for accumulation. There's also a way in which one can surely think of accumulation from time to time in a negative sense, kind of a negative sense of the term. Take the best case for this, classical evolutionary theory, which had very specific assumptions about linearity, about the internal dynamics of growth, and about the beginning point and the end point of civilization, right? Well, along come the diffusionists, and they point out that not all societies develop along these lines because they borrow from one another. And along come the positivists, who point out great deficiencies in the database, anthropological database for that the anthropologists are basing these evolutionary themes on. Well, classical evolutionary theory got pretty much discredited on the basis of these kinds of discoveries. And that's not to say diffusionism was an advance. Well, it was an advance in the sense that it didn't make some of the same mistakes as classical evolutionary theory, but you can't say it built on it in a cumulative way. In other words, you get insights, you get new principles, you do get some new discoveries, and you get, piled on top of that, the fact that because we don't have quite such decisive criteria by which we would like to displace a paradigm that we would like to displace, paradigms have a way of not going away. You can never have a decisive test that says, no, that was out and this one's in. You know, the physicists do that all the time, or at least they incorporate another one into a broader, as a special case, into a broader theory. And we don't quite have the criteria to be able to do that. So what we have is we have an accumulation, but we don't have the concomitant shedding of paradigms. And I would certainly not want to apply a strict evolutionary cumulative model to the development of the social sciences. I just think you're just totally wrong in that regard. It's a very mixed picture.
But you do characterize in your essay called The Optimum Scope of Sociology, you do characterize sociology as an immature discipline that will become mature when it sort of adopts a singular paradigm.
I don't know. I did not say that. I dare you to find that viewpoint in that book. I talked about sociology as having a number of foci of preoccupations that defined their dependent and independent variables. I did not, and I did speak of the immaturity of our capacity to have these linkages made. And I talked about a diversity of strengths of different approaches. But I would like you to go back and reread that. I don't believe you would find an evolutionary bias in there. But if you do, I'll accept it.
Let me quote maybe it'll help to quote a little bit from the article that Scott mentioned. You say here, it may be correct to view the future of sociology as one of spinning off some frameworks and consolidating those that remain. But I do not view this pattern of growth considered alone as optimal. The growth of new specialties, however scientifically adequate they may be, always raises new questions about their relations with other bodies of knowledge. More specialization will aggravate the already pressing problem of the insulation of the various branches of the behavioral sciences from one another. Optimally, a new pattern of integrating knowledge should arise, simultaneously a pattern whereby the implications of one discipline or subdiscipline for the work of others becomes a subject of disciplined inquiry in itself.
Okay,
Um,
that's fine. That goes behind a methodological preoccupation that I've repeated from time to time. Namely, that any time you, well, it goes back to the very first one we were talking about selecting facts and problems. You see, once you select a given focus of inquiry, say informal demography, and you narrow it down into the models and projections and analyses of demographic data, and then you try to generate explanations about, say, fertility behavior, and so on. You immediately, in doing that, you get back into the business of psychology, because you are making some assumptions about the conditions under which people will decide to have or not to have children, right? But these are sort of constants, or, I mean, you decide that. You think children, for example, are an economic commodity, and you will have them so long as they're not an economic burden. Okay, that's a very common assumption that demographers and economists make. Well, now, is that good psychology or not? You simplify psychology without making any necessary linkages to the kinds of knowledge that might be being generated in that field itself, right? And so, what I'm saying is that in order to advance empirical knowledge about any given aspect of the world we study, it's necessary to simplify things, to make your explanations manageable. But in so simplifying, you make assumptions about other parts of the world that are unexamined by and large, and those ought to be looked at too, right? And that means interdisciplinary discipline. But now that is not an evolutionary statement.
That goes back to your notion of growth. Is that what you think? That that's part of the
That's
paradigm
part of
growth in the
part of the
social
process. See, most people think that growth is constituted solely of increasing knowledge of increased knowledge in specialized bodies, specialized lines of inquiry, right? And that's a kind of big component of scientific growth that people talk to. And I said, well, that isn't the whole story with respect to knowledge, because we leave out this kind of freezing of the parameters of your investigation, and those also have to be investigated. That's the thing that Parsons and I were very much concerned with in comparing different models of the economy of the neoclassic and Keynesian sort. And what it was that Keynes changed in order to make different predictions were really psychological assumptions about how people behave under different economic conditions, right? And that the main basis on which economic theories can be compared with one another is the assumptions they make about human nature and human motivation.
So in some sense, Keynes didn't simply add on to the neoclassical.
He changed them. He changed the assumptions about conditions under which workers will remain unemployed. He changed the assumptions under which people will save, the assumptions under the principles under which people will invest money, and the assumptions under which people will want to turn their stocks into liquid funds.
Yes.
And those were the four major psychological changes that Keynes read into his theory, and he produced a different result for the functioning of the whole economy by building in these new assumptions.
from the same social facts, so to speak, by adding a
Well,
changing the psychological dimension.
Well, you see, the unemployment wasn't really a problem for the neoclassicists, because they thought unemployment would clear once certain choices were made on the part of different actors in terms of their own utility functions. And so they did not have any explanation for unemployment. Didn't come as a problem for them, where it obviously came as a problem for Keynes, because he was living in the middle of mass unemployment in many nations. And his theoretical genius was well, he wasn't genius to discover unemployment, but to develop a scheme by which heretofore unsolvable problems within the corpus of neoclassical economics could now be given some sort of explanation. Well, in the meantime, of course, the Keynesian assumptions about economics, unemployment, and so on have been themselves been challenged and to some degree discredited, but nonetheless, that's the nature of advance that was made.
If we could go back to this question of sociology as a mature or immature discipline, let me read you the quote that lead me to think about this, which preceded the quote that you read. You say that sociology is too comprehensive, diffuse, soft in the center and fuzzy around the edges. These qualities make for a field that is enormously complex and engaging, but less scientifically adequate than might be optimal. It follows that if sociology continues its movement toward scientific maturity, it must be expected that it will shed certain aspects of these frameworks and consolidate others. So I guess what I understand that is it doesn't have to be a consensus around one paradigm, but sort of a consensus around a method of inquiry.
Method of inquiry and a willingness to acknowledge. Well, I guess the kind of model I have in terms of advance is the one I just summarized about Keynes as the neoclassic. That's to say, Keynesianism isn't the only paradigm in economics. There are a lot of them.
Yes.
And I dare say it's not the best from every standpoint, right? But nonetheless, there are ways in which you can see that there was a palpable advance over the way people thought about the economic world at the time. I believe we can. Now, I suppose that that one of the fields in which we could make some claims in sociology to this effect, just to choose an example, would be in the field of the analysis of formal organizations, which we had a number of models around. We had the neoclassical model, which is kind of a black box model driven by people maximizing their own economic choices, both as individuals and as a firm. We had the Weberian model, which in fact did not regard ends as uncertain, nor the knowledge between means and ends as uncertain. And the history of the study of formal organization has been the history of relaxing those assumptions and learning something about the behavior of organization under conditions of uncertainty, for example, and under conditions of their changing environments, that Weber's view of bureaucracy would not have permitted us to know about, right? So that's the sort of thing, well, some of these are going to get changed too. I mean, it's a ferment, really. I guess when I talk about maturity, I don't have an end point in mind. I have a process in mind, I believe.
Since you wrote that article, which I believe was written in 1967, somewhere around there, do you feel that sociology has become more mature?
Well, again, I would have to. I believe you'd have to go down different lines of inquiry. You would have to do a detailed analysis of different types of endeavor. I find it very difficult to think of the field as a whole and apply adjectives. I use the word immature, I must say, but I'm uncomfortable at characterizing an entire field in these global or as though it's a thing that grows up.
Yeah, an organism.
Like a person grows up.
Right.
That's where we get that language of maturity from,
Yeah.
people and
Right.
ripening and that sort of thing. And the imagery doesn't help me too much in thinking about the fields as a whole. I mean, there are some areas in which there's been a dying on the vine. I mean, the particular approach, say, in anthropology to culture and personality, that was so thriving in the post-war period for a couple of decades, just seemed to reach an end point of what it could say about the world, given its assumptions and its methods. And there are other areas in which I think you can say that this kind of process that I characterize has been going on. Demography, formal organization, stratification, to some degree, work in the family. But you just have to go down the line, and it will be qualitatively different in every case.
Right.
So you don't get this whole gross movement of the field.
A big question that this course has addressed, and which has been addressed in the interviews, is sort of how the sociologist should view the world outside of sociology.
In a normative way?
In a normative way, and simply how he or she should take their study of society, and how they should present that to the outside world. Should it be presented in an objective way, or should the sociologist conceive of their sort of task as a normative one, from the moment one looks at a fact to the moment that the person brings that study to the public at large?
Well, I believe that a social science cannot advertise itself as a social movement to large society. For two reasons. One is social movements invariably have the idea that they've got the right answers on the state of the world, and they also have a normative stance as to where the world ought to go. Well, we all have that as individuals, but to advertise that to the larger world is fakery, because we don't have the answers. And it's oversell, and you always get in trouble. I've seen it happen so many times with government agencies and other founders. We're going to get it. We don't get it. But it's also, given the institutionalization of the social sciences in the universities, it's a very important point that people don't think about. The university is institutionalized to build a degree of dispassion into inquiry. That's the normative basis of university life. And those are the kind of values that is, in that kind of institution we value. And I've seen enough cases where universities try to get into the larger world and tell them how to run their affairs in a general way, and you don't survive under those circumstances.
So you would then there would be some demarcation then between sociologist and citizen.
Absolutely, I hold that distinction pretty strongly. And the obligations and associated with both those two roles are different. That's why I make and the privileges.
I think it would be helpful if you, Professor Smelser, elaborated on, rather than it being kind of a strict demarcation or a dichotomization between private social scientist and public person, if you could speak a little bit about the reason, not just the reasons why that exists, but the different component parts for why is that a difficulty for a person who sits in a university setting? Is it a political problem? Is it a social problem? Is it a psychological? How does that break down, or does it, in the context of actually being in a university whose normative standard is dispassionate?
Well,
where's the press?
Let me answer that in perhaps more personal terms, in light of an assignment that I've been involved with over the last 5 or 6 years. There's a Washington-based committee called the Committee on Basic Research in Behavioral and Social Sciences. It was formed just before the Reagan administration came in, and it was given an assignment to write up a report on the value, significance, and utility of social science knowledge. All right, there we are. We're right in the middle of what your question.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Now, this committee, of which I was a member and have subsequently come to chair, undertook this task, and we had a tremendous difficulty with that issue, tremendous difficulty as to exactly what ought to be the way that social and behavioral scientists communicate with the public, and particularly in this case, the government, which constitutes a great source of its own livelihood and support. Well, we came up with that distinction about trying to sell normative stands to government authorities. And we agreed that that was not the role of social and behavioral scientists. We did, however, see a number of other roles, many of which were less direct than that. You see, that's a kind of naive model of how the social process works. You know, a bunch of intellectuals telling the society how to run its affairs, and then they either do it or don't do it.
That's social engineering.
Yeah, social engineering, and also the idea that a society's normative values can flow somehow or other from knowledge that's being generated. It's all very naive, and I'm very glad we rejected that. However, with respect to, again, you have several levels. With respect to methods which may be useful in other forms of inquiry and decision-making, well, that's that's a place where there's a clear possibility for what the social sciences do and what other people are in the business of doing. That's a less complicated one. That is to say, the borrowing of the survey method for political polls and that sort of thing. I mean, that's quite clear that there's something being given. There are also certain types of discoveries that are made that affect policy changes by virtue of the kind of knowledge that has been undertaken. I'll give you a simple example, that the psycholinguists have come up with a number of really extraordinary studies as to the degree of sophistication that deaf children display when they learn, and they've been able to demonstrate that through experiments. And this has changed the whole pedagogy and how you treat deaf children in the schools for that purpose. There's a discovery that proves useful, right, in some kind of end that we regard as valuable, namely socializing children as best we possibly can, okay? Then comes a third area which is murkier. And this is where social scientists play an extremely important role. It's when various kinds of viewpoints and theories that are developed in the social and behavioral sciences become more widely recognized in larger circles and come to influence the way of thinking of policymakers, right? I'll give you an example. Well, I mean, most of these, the whole work on the American soldier of World War II, a lot of innovations is what Army life was really like. The people who were in the military periods of responsibility never had any ideas about the sources of morale of the troops and so on and so forth. Changed their whole view of what military life was like. The Appearance of the American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal brought in a perspective about the understanding of race relations that we just didn't have before. And these things sort of, the whole concept of unemployment as developed by economists and sociologists has played a huge role in how we define unemployment publicly, in terms of whether it's the responsibility of the individual worker for not being able to find work. I mean, the concept of structural employment now is in everybody's language. That was technical discoveries out of economics and sociology, right? So you do change policies by this diffusion of knowledge, but that's rather difficult of going in and advertising certain policies about unemployment and its management. You see, I think that's the way it goes, and that's the way it should go. And that the public, especially governmental agencies, should stop asking for specific answers like, you go out and do a study and that study will be useful in the reduction of crime or something like that. That doesn't work that way. But I think the rendition that I've now given, a kind of longish response to your question, summarizes the way I feel about the role of social scientists and the different ways in which their work diffuses out into the larger society.
If I could ask one more question following up to that, sort of to make sure I understand what you're saying. In a sense, the sociologist shouldn't advertise his policy prescription to the outside world, but he can take problems that exist in the outside world and make own normative judgments about what it is he wants to understand and study.
Yep. And he can have any view he wants as a citizen and activist, and many of us have expressed those opinions and so on. And we might even think that our opinions are in keeping with something we know about society. But that's, I believe, not to be done in your technical and official capacity as a sociologist.
Professor Smelser, you mentioned that you're chairing the Behavioral and Social Sciences Research Committee?
Basic Research.
Basic Research Committee. And as a follow-on to the last question, I was wondering if you could speak to the issue of how both social and or behavioral science information produced by the social or behavioral scientists winds up, in your estimation, being politically managed within the realm of social policy or public policy, and how the persons who produce knowledge can best effectuate that type of information management.
Well, the answer sort of follows on to something I just said a little bit ago, namely that the perspectives that emerge out of social behavioral science research have a tremendous impact on the way the world is viewed, employment, race relations, and that sort of of thing. Well, the social behavioral sciences differ to a great degree in what kind of aspects of society that they study. And speaking about sociology particularly, sociology, because it stresses the importance of social institutions in the generation of social problems, is likely not to be regarded by many politicians in a very popular way, particularly conservative politicians, because if you identify a problem as being social in character, it calls for a public response, because it's taking public responsibility for it. Whereas the problem can be defined as individual in character, well then, tough, that's the problem with the individual. I mean, we had that whole thing with unemployment, didn't we? As to now be regarded more as a system problem than an individual problem, the way it was in the early days of high capitalism, right? Social behavioral sciences had a lot to say about that change. Well, now, this brings to mind the pattern of assaults that came up in the Reagan administration, the conservative administration, on the social behavioral sciences in terms of who should receive research funds. And there was a kind of a double animus there. The first was, I would have to say, primarily political. That, well, I know Reagan thinks of sociologists as a bunch of lefties. He said so. He said so during the free speech, during the years following the free speech movement. The sociology department did something about the Cambodian War or something like that, and he made a public statement and said, "Well, we know those types. There they go again."
First time he said that.
So we know, yeah, the first. But he had his view of the radicals, right? Radical nuts in sociology, philosophy, and so on. And well, that mentality sort of reflected itself, as you know, in the cuts, in the targeted budget cut. I mean, genetics big, psychobiology big, brain research big, psychopharmacological research big, and big attacks on those types of social scientists that tended to deal with the world in macro terms. Well, it's a mixed picture. Not all of them were regarded as radical, and it was really kind of ironic that the economists were going to be getting these kinds of cuts as well as the social scientists, particularly since he makes good use of conservative economists. And matter of fact, that was a mistake. But they couldn't be too openly political, you see. Then they would have gotten themselves in trouble if they'd been too openly political and intervening in what is supposed to be general public support for the generation of knowledge. Well, that's what the motive was, I believe, in attacking the relatively puny Behavioral and Social Sciences division in the National Science Foundation, puny in terms of the amount of funds it gets compared with the rest. At the same time, some of the behavioral and social scientists went along with this, namely those who were not going to be cut, create an internal division. And the basis on which they went along with this, that's exactly the right thing to do, because our fields are more scientific than those soft fields, right? So there was this convergence of academic and political judgments to the same end. And one of the things that really saved us is that the natural and biological scientists in the National Science Foundation, in the last analysis, even though they have absolutely no use for the behavioral and social sciences in general, they think we're a little needle in their side. We're the ones that get them into all the trouble, and at the same time we don't really figure very much in their budget. So we got a lot of hostility from the physicists and chemists and biologists in the National Science Foundation. But in the last analysis, they decided not to let that wedge be driven, and they supported the restitution of support for behavioral and social sciences. Well, to just make one little more twist on this, more general topic of the relationship between the academic world and the larger public, the National Science Foundation, in keeping with the congressional bodies and with the Office of Management and Budget, has now openly asked the behavioral and social scientists to influence their priorities in giving. Now that's a tremendous intervention if you think about it, because if they take this committee's recommendation seriously, they're going to channel funds into certain behavioral and social sciences And insofar as they generate new findings, those are gonna float out into the larger world themselves and have the kind of impact on broader society that I spoke of before, largely through the diffusion of frameworks and information and discoveries. So that's the current commission of that committee, is to say something about exciting lines of research in behavioral social sciences which look promising, which for the next 5 to 10 years ought to be a kind of agenda, ought to be reviewed after that, of course, in a similar kind of review enterprise that we're undertaking. But you see, we're caught in a kind of situation there in Washington, whereby all the other behavioral and social sciences all the other sciences are telling the world what they want. I mean, the astronomers can tell you exactly what kind of superpowered telescope they need each year for the next 10 years. That's a priority, you see, and they'll get them. And that's viewed as a model report. And we've got this very, very difficult intellectual and political enterprise to try to communicate to the funding agencies precisely how to maintain that balance between the general support of general research, which is what we want, and areas which we can genuinely testify as being leading and possibly innovative and important lines of work.